Zarathustra is such a visionary and a herald of things to come that one almost wonders whether he was a man from the future. Also known by the mistaken Greek rendering of his name as Zoroaster or Golden Star, Zarathustra actually means golden camel. Horses and camels were the most prized animals in the northern Iranian culture that was Zarathustra's milieu, and so many names ended with either aspa, meaning horse, or ushtra, meaning camel. This is, of course, a reference to the Central Asian camel, not that of Arabia. In what follows, Zarathustra, the form of Zarathustra's name, popularized by Germans such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Richard Strauss, will be consistently used. Zarathustra's salvific descent from the glowing peaks of the Zagros and Alborz mountains into a world of ritualistic religion and regressive mythology ultimately sets the dark forest of human ignorance on fire, turning night into day. Of course, this can only be appreciated when we set his teachings in the context of the worldview of the time, as reflected in the scriptures and epics of the cultures of his epoch. Only when we consider the archaic forms of Hebrew, Greek, and Indo-Iranian, or Aryan, societies does it become possible to understand just how revolutionary Zarathustra's humanistic conception of utopian innovation really was, and why it is the wellspring for all other conceptions of utopia. The oldest form of ancient Israelite religion that has been reconstructed by scholars dating to the late 2nd millennium BCE is very different from contemporary Judaism or even the Judaism of the time of Jesus. The God of the Jews was simply the Lord, or Adonai, the chieftain of a group of gods known as the Elohim. He is a humanoid being that often interacts rather directly with his elect amongst mortals, such as Abraham, Jacob, or the elders of Israel, and when he sends emissaries, malachim, in his stead, these angels do not have wings, as later artistic convention would have it. They are humanoid beings no different in kind from himself. The oldest strata of the Torah depicts Yahweh as a wrathful warlord and a vengeful legislator, one whose commandments do not recognize personal autonomy. Yahweh, or Jehovah, threatens to bring destruction upon the 3rd and 4th generation of those who break their covenant with him, punishing children for the sins of their parents, while he promises to reward the 1000th generation of the descendants of those who uphold the revealed law. This law includes a divine mandate for slavery and for the buying and selling of women as property. Ritual purification and bloody animal sacrifices are a very prominent part of this revelation. Some scholars believe that until the 7th century BCE, these rituals even included human sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. All of the moral laws, rituals, and conceptions of divinity in the Torah are embedded within the story of a particular people and their land. There is no universality whatsoever to this message. The deity that bestows the promised land upon the Jews, and to which they are bound as little more than slaves, is not by any means a universal God, nor does Yahweh promise them a heavenly afterlife as a reward for their loyalty. The archaic Jews did not see death as a means of return to the Garden of Eden or anything like that. They viewed Sheol as a gloomy underworld realm of departed spirits who wander there aimlessly with no distinction drawn between the fate of the righteous and the lot of the wicked. The idea of the afterlife appears to have entered Judaism and by extension Christianity, and later Islam, via Zarathustra's influence. In the Gathas at Yasna 45:8, 54, and 51:15, we are presented with an image of the Garo Demona, or House of Song, on the other side of the Chinvat Peretu, or Sorting Bridge, wherein one confronts one's dana, or conscience, before crossing over, presumably after death. Some have interpreted these phrases metaphorically, for example with the House of Song being remembrance of a heroic life, as in the poems sung about heroes, or the sorting bridge that crosses over an abyssal chasm being built out of the planks of one's deeds in life. The more righteous the deeds, the more solid and substantive the bridge. If we cross the waters of the Mediterranean Sea to Greece, of the late 2nd millennium BC, we find a culture even more primitive than that of the Hebrews. The first script was not written in Greece until sometime around the 8th century BC, and even then only a semi-literate society would persist well into the 5th century BC. Classicists believe that works such as the Iliad of Homer or the core content of Hesiod's Theogony, which were only written down circa 700 BC, may date to around 1200 BC at the earliest. Heinrich Schliemann's discovery of the remains of Troy, which is the setting for the Trojan War recounted in the Iliad, factored into this, since the ruins are dated to circa 1200 BC, which corresponds to Eratosthenes' claim that the war elapsed from 1194 to 1184 BC. In this pre-literate archaic setting, the songs of poets acted as a way to preserve and pass on cultural and moral authority. The poetic epics of the Greek oral tradition were a proto-encyclopedia and a folk history embedded with the religious worldview of the culture and utterly lacking in a secular capacity for critical reflection. As Eric Havelock argues persuasively in his landmark study, Preface to Plato, passages in the Iliad and the Odyssey that describe practical tasks such as shipbuilding, the historical documentation of the catalogue of ships, or the behavioral patterns exemplified by Greek heroes are in fact the primary content of these works. The epic narrative is a secondary means of delivering this content into the consciousness of society, or rather of structuring that consciousness from the ground up in such a way as to conform to this customary mold. This means of delivery is particularly potent when one considers how, in the enactment of epic poetry, the message is literally embodied in the dramatic physical movements of the bard who recites, in a way comparable to contemporary rap music. Its paradigmatic structures are thereby hardwired into the physiology of the audience and thus literally constitute the social fabric without any mediating reflection. The mythic religiosity of archaic Greece is a worldview in which the might of heroes makes them right, and man is always trying to find a reprieve from the jealousy and wrath of feuding gods by offering sacrifices of animals and riches of gold and jewels up to appease these Olympians. The Hellenic pantheon was replete with sexual intrigue, murderous machinations, and capricious warmongering. Zeus treats other gods and goddesses as pawns, and mere mortals are hapless victims of his sadistic whims. Even more disturbing than this is the fact that, especially in the Iliad, which is older than the Odyssey, this human drama has a particularly soulless quality. Greek words such as psyche, phrenes, and nous, that much later developed the connotation of mind, heart, and soul, are rendered anachronistically as such by modern translators. They have a more physical sense in the older language of the Iliad. No one, neither a mortal nor a god, could escape fate, and whenever a crucial decision must be made by a mortal, a god intervenes to put that notion into his head or heart. As Julian Jaynes argues in his book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, we would be making a mistake to interpret these incidents as metaphorical. The subtlety involved in the use of metaphor was not yet grasped by the Greeks of the late 2nd millennium BCE. Rather, we must take the absolute power of fate and the constant intercession of the gods, as the origin of all ideas and of all passions that move mortals, as evidence for a startling lack of free will, conscience, and the ability to take personal responsibility. The ultimate fate to which Greek man was damned is, of course, death, which in the earliest traditions meant a passage to Hades, the eternal abode of shades, very much comparable to the aforementioned Hebrew notion of Sheol. This was conceived of as an underworld of spirits wherein good and bad people would wander equally bereft of any higher purpose. In light of this woeful end, the only aim of life, which was fulfilled in an exemplary fashion by heroes, was to win a fame that would promise immortality through dramatic deeds worthy of remembrance in the songs of poets. It would be 500 years before the 7 sages and the first philosophical proverbs of Delphi, 700 years before the dawn of pre-Socratic philosophy, and 1,000 years before Plato would come on his mission to break the spell of the archaic Greek poets. The Greeks represented the western branch of an Indo-European community of nations or peoples that stretched, at that time, from Eastern Europe to northern India. The cultural matrix of Zarathustra was the eastern branch of this community, namely the Indo-Iranians, or, as they referred to themselves in their native language of Sanskrit, the Aryans. The Vedas were composed from about 1400 to 900 BC, in a period before the breakup of this ethnic group into 2 distinct peoples, the Iranians, who migrated to the plateau between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, and the Indians, who settled around the Indus River Valley, where they colonized the native population of Dravidians. The first thing that the Vedic Aryans did when they conquered the Dravidian population was to establish a caste system that subjugated the natives by incorporating them into the lowest rungs of an extremely rigid theocratic hierarchy. The term caste is a translation of the Sanskrit varna, which is the root of the English varnish, which literally means color coding system, in a reference to the phenotypic characteristics of the Aryan conquerors as compared to the native Indus Valley population. This population became either chandalas, namely untouchables, so low that they do not even fit into the caste system, or they were confined to the lowest 2 castes, the Shudras, or hard-working manual laborers, and the Vaishyas, or merchants and farmers. The Aryans themselves were divided into the 2 uppermost castes, that of the Kshatriyas, or noble knightly warriors, and that of the Brahmins, the elite of sacrificial priests, versed in the Sanskrit scriptures. If low-caste people were to so much as accidentally hear the Vedic verses being recited by the Brahmins, their ears were to be filled with molten metal. Unlike a rise in social class in other societies or in later epochs, advancement from one caste up to the next could never take place within a single lifetime. The only way up was to die having dutifully fulfilled the responsibilities proper to one's own caste. Then, based on the positive karma that would accrue from this disciplined submission, one could hope to be reincarnated into a higher caste. The devas, or gods, of the Vedic Aryans were seen as a kind of uppermost caste even above the Brahmins, and it was believed that these gods and goddesses, devis, could also fall into reincarnation into a lower caste, as a Brahmin or Kshatriya, if they sowed bad karma. In the Vedas, we see a vast pantheon of devas and devis: Agni, Soma, Indra, Mitra, Varuna, Rudra, Vishnu, and so forth. In the most archaic strata of Vedic religion, these are for the most part uncompromisingly bloodthirsty deities who demand constant sacrifice. The horse was a sacred animal to the ancient Aryans, and one of the most important rites was the horse sacrifice. A beloved and victorious racehorse was bound to the pyre alive, with 2 men holding down its legs on each side. Then, with the sound of the horse's whining resounding in his ears, a priest with an axe would hack the animal to pieces, cutting first with 1 stroke through its ribs. More auspicious was the ritual of the man, a human sacrifice undertaken regularly as a reenactment of the creation, for which the Rig Vedic priests are infamous. According to Vedic mythology, the gods created the world by dismembering the cosmic giant Purusha, from whose severed limbs the world and the 4 castes of the Varna system are born. Quote, "When they divided the man, his mouth became the Brahmin, his arms were made into the warrior, his thighs the people, and from his feet the servants were born. The moon was born from his mind. From his eye the sun was born. Indra and Agni came from his mouth, and from his vital breath the wind was born. From his navel the middle realm of space arose. From his head the sky evolved. From his 2 feet came the earth, and the quarters of the sky from his ear. Thus the gods set the world in order." Unquote. The hymn may even seem quaint to a modern reader, but not when one considers that as it was chanted, the best man of the community was anointed with liquefied butter, ghee, upon a grassy field, then bound upon thrice and 7 fuel sticks as the sacrificial beast, quote unquote. The priests proceeded to hack off the limbs of the living victim one by one with an axe, and he would then be cooked until he was well done. There is a special verse of supplication for the melted flesh stuck on the pyre and the axe not to remain behind, but to be taken up by the gods along with the rest of the man. To this end, all of the implements of sacrifice would also be offered into the fire. In a variation of the ritual performed for the cremation of the dead, the priests would embalm the dead man with a special mixture that would prevent him from being wholly consumed by the first low-burning fire, thus perfecting him for presentation to the gods. Then a second blazing fire would be kindled to carry the man to heaven. Large parts of the Vedas concern spells and magic, for everything from cures to illnesses to winning back one's husband and afflicting adversaries with various evils. Among the Rigvedic deities mentioned above were Mitra and Varuna, who were so closely associated with one another that they were sometimes invoked as the single deity, Mitra Varuna. Understanding Mitra is key to reconstructing the context of Zarathustra and the development of concepts integral to his utopian vision. Mitra was the most prominent of a class of deities that stood opposed to the devas or Vedic gods. These beings are referred to as Asuras in Sanskrit, a term that is essentially equivalent to titans in a Greek or classical Western context. For example, Prometheus is a titan. So is Atlas. Both are punished by Zeus for encouraging humanity to rebel against the Olympian gods. Likewise, in Vedic religion, the Asuras are engaged in a war of rebellion against the devas, and Hindu epics feature instances of Asuras empowering human rulers who have the courage to stand up against the gods. The leader of the gods and chief enemy of the Asuras is Indra, who is essentially equivalent to the Greek Zeus. Both are derived from the more primordial Indo-European sky father figure. When Zarathustra uses the term Ahura as a descriptor for his conception of God, he is using the ancient Iranian cognate of the Sanskrit word Ashura. Zarathustra explicitly condemns the devas in the Gathas, making specific reference to an incident wherein they gathered together and then rushed in to destroy human life on a large scale. He also sees the devas as agents of Druj, or the lie, in other words, as deceivers. Some have interpreted these passages from a secular, modern perspective, which construes them as suggesting that Zarathustra thought that the devas are false gods because they do not really exist. However, paying close attention to the formulation of the relevant passages in the Gathas, it is possible to argue that he knows that they exist and that they have waged war on humanity in the past. In that case, they would be false gods only insofar as they are great deceivers. By referring to Mazda as Ahura and by associating the devas with deceit as compared to the association of Ahura with truth, Zarathustra is drawing from the cult of Ashura Mitra, or as the ancient Iranians called him, Mithra. This titan was the greatest enemy of the devas, one who would, quote, crush the skulls of the devas, unquote, and he was also the Lord of Truth, who was a vengeful punisher of oath breakers. Oaths and promises were made by swearing to Mithra, with the right hand raised. Finally, the Varuna of Mitra Varuna would become Baruna, the rains, or the water goddess, Aban, the waters, or Anahita, the consort of Mitra in Achaemenid Zoroastrianism. Some scholars suspect that this titan was originally an androgynous figure, and that its male and female aspects were later split off to become Mitra or Mithra and Varuna, Baruna, Aban or Anahita. At the same time, although he sides with the Titanic Mithra worshippers against the Vedic Deva cult, Zarathustra is critiquing and opposing many aspects of the cult of Mithra as well. In the Gathas, where Zarathustra condemns the wrathful semi-nomadic cattle-raiding warlords who are drunk on homa, or soma, and who violently harass and oppress the settled agrarian population, and whose mumbling priests engage in bloody karpan, or sacrifices. There is good reason to read these passages as references to the Mithra cult of his fellow Iranians who had already rejected the devas that were still being revered by their Vedic Aryan cousins, those who invaded India. The Mithra cultists worshipped an inverted sword planted into a stone platform. They would sacrifice 1 out of every 100 prisoners of war that they enslaved and pour the blood of this sacrificial victim over the sword. These warriors who worshipped Mithra would scalp their enemies, decorating their garments and their quivers with these scalps in a competition for who had collected the most scalps. After scraping the skin off the faces and heads of their enemies, they would carve out the skulls and then dip them into molten metal in order to craft them into drinking vessels. From out of these skull chalices they would drink homa or soma in Sanskrit, a psychotropic form of liquor or intoxicant that would drive them into a violent, ecstatic frenzy like the berserkers of Nordic Europe. They were even known on occasion to mix the blood of their enemies into this drink. Drunk on this homa, they would raid and rustle the cattle of settled agrarian populations, slaughtering them and incorporating the bull's horns into their helmets. The plea of the soul of the cow, quote-unquote, at the outset of the Gathas should be considered in this context. A giant wild boar, Verathragna, Bahram in Pahlavi, was an avatar of Mithra and the god of war, the ancient Iranian equivalent of Ares or Mars. In the young Avestan texts, which were written after the time of Zarathustra, Mithra is incorporated into the theology of Zoroastrianism. However, scholars recognize that hymns such as the Mehr Yasht or Aban Yasht, the hymns to Mithra and Anahita, are older, pre-Zoroastrian hymns that have been modified in order to be assimilated. This is a very common process in the history of theology. There can be little doubt that the original form of the Mithra cult is as much a target of Zarathustra's utopian message in the Gathas as is the Deva worship of the Vedic Aryans. His is a third way, although it adopts the epithet Ashura or Ahura, as well as the Mithraic inversion that demonizes the Devas as sadistic and manipulatively deceptive beings unworthy of worship. Understanding those verses in the Gathas that rail against the drunken warlords, cattle raiders, and sacrificial priests as references to Mithra cultists is one key to determining the date of Zarathustra. The question is hotly debated, and 3 vastly differing dates have been proposed for the life and time of Zarathustra. The boldest proposal is that made by Mary Sedagast, an American scholar of the Neolithic period. Sedagast proposed that Zarathustra lived 8,500 years before the present, on the cusp of the transition between the astrological ages of Cancer and Gemini. Sedagast first made this claim about Zarathustra in Plato Prehistorian, a book that takes an archaeological and anthropological approach to validating Plato's legend of Atlantis. With backing from Iranian nationalists, she then explored the thesis at greater length in a volume titled When Zarathustra Spoke. Sedagast marshals 2 types of evidence to support her argument. The first type consists of a series of statements made by less than a handful of classical Greek authors. Xanthus claimed that Zarathustra lived 6,000 years before Xerxes crossed the Hellespont. Eudoxus of Cnidus, 404 to 355 BC, asserted that Zarathustra lived 6,000 years before the death of Plato. The Magi who attended Plato's funeral supposedly made this claim, although we have no direct evidence of that. Aristotle writes that he agrees with this date, but he does not tell us why. Plutarch, 45 to 120 CE, dates Zarathustra to 5,000 years before the Trojan War, again without giving any reason for such an early date. In other words, all of these authors are pointing toward the late Neolithic period, circa 6,500 BC, or 8,500 years before the present. Spentas then turns to archaeological and anthropological evidence from this period in order to substantiate her thesis. In this epoch, we see three things happen. The bull horns that were incorporated into the architecture and furniture of this culture, and which suggested a bull-sacrificing society of hunters, suddenly disappear. There is, at this time, also evidence for an agricultural revolution. Finally, a new firing technique is devised that allows for the crafting of high-contrast black-white pottery designs. Supposedly, the first of these developments is reflected in Zarathustra's condemnation of the cattle-raiding warriors and sacrificial priests of the Gathas. The second development is reflected in Zarathustra's advocacy of agricultural cultivation as a holy duty, and his defense of settled farming communities against roving semi-nomadic raiders. In the third development, Spentas sees the significance of fire for Zarathustra and his dualistic opposition between cosmic forces of light and darkness. The second proposed date for Zarathustra is that he lived anywhere from 1500 to 1000 BC. The Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, author of The Lives of the Philosophers, agrees with the latter end of this spectrum of possible dates. Diogenes aside, as the only classical author who makes this claim, this proposal was first argued for in a serious way by European scholars in the 19th century. It is based entirely on linguistics and literary analysis. Shortly after European linguistics discovered the Indo-European language family and then traced out the Indo-Iranian branch of it, it was noticed that the language of the Gathas is very close to the oldest form of Sanskrit that we find in the Rig Veda. The latter had been dated to between 1400 and 900 BC. Consequently, it was assumed that this was also the time frame for Zarathustra, and that the rampaging warlords, Kavis, and sacrificial priests, Karpans, in the Gathas were references to Rig Vedic era Kshatriyas and Rishis. In other words, that Zoroastrianism is a direct reaction against the early Vedic Deva cult. On this hypothesis, Zarathustra's revolt may have even been the catalyst for the breakup of the Indo-Iranian community into distinct Indian and Iranian groups, the former of which went on to invade India, whereas the latter migrated into the plateau that they named Iranian after themselves. The third date proposed for Zarathustra, and the one that was accepted as canonical by most Zoroastrians until the modern age, is, quote, 258 years before Alexander, unquote. Since it is a statement made from an Iranian perspective, this has generally been understood to mean 258 years before the coming of Alexander to Iran, rather than 258 years before the birth of the Macedonian leader. Consistent with the classical custom of dating people to the time of their flourishing rather than their birth, the formulation here has also customarily been taken to mean that Zarathustra began preaching with the patronage and protection of King Goshtasp 258 years before Alexander. If he was 42 at the time that he entered the court of King Goshtasp, this would put the birth of Zarathustra at circa 628 BC. This is approximately 28 years before the birth of Cyrus the Great, whose grandfather, through his mother, Princess Mandane, was King Astyages of Media. This would date Zarathustra's composition of the Gathas in a complete form to no earlier than 580 BC, a few years after his arrival in the court of Goshtasp, a patron who he thanks for his protection in the Gathas. If Zarathustra was actually 77 years old when he died, as Zoroastrian tradition claims, then he would have been promulgating his revolutionary utopian message until the year 551 BC. This would mean that Cyrus the Great had already replaced his grandfather on the throne of Media, in Ecbatana or present-day Hamadan, and had been ruling it for 8 years, while Zarathustra was still alive, albeit hundreds of miles away on the Median border with Turan, in the Khorasan region of Iran. This would explain why, by contrast with his Achaemenid successors, such as Darius and Xerxes, Cyrus makes no reference to Zarathustra or to any of his ideas, such as Ahura Mazda, Duruj, Asha, or Arta, and so forth, in any of his royal inscriptions. It would be because Cyrus had never even heard of Zarathustra. Zoroastrian references only appear in Achaemenid inscriptions, or for that matter in any inscriptions, in the reign of Darius the Great, beginning in 522 BC, in other words 29 years after the death of Zarathustra. Interestingly, the father of Darius is named Vishtaspa, and he was the satrap of Bactria, Balkh, a region in eastern Khorasan, present-day northeastern Afghanistan, on the border with Turan, or Scythia. In other words, he was a petty king, a kind of feudal lord, really, with the same name as the king that was the patron of Zarathustra, and in the same region as this king was supposed to have ruled, and where Zarathustra may have been killed by a Turanian invasion. Now, the Turanians are the Scythian, or Sakha branch of Iranians. They were named after their patriarch Tur, one of the three sons of Feridun, together with Iraj and Salm, or Sarm. Between 700 and 630 BCE, the Scythians, or Turanians, had swept down from Central Asia to conquer the Median kingdom. In 585 BC, led by King Astyages, grandfather of Cyrus, the Medes rebelled against their Scythian overlords and pushed them back into Central Asia, with the realm of Vishtaspa being right on the new border. This also marked the first expansion of Media so far to the northeast of the Iranian plateau. The Scythians are the drunken and sacrificial Mithraic warlords, Kavis, whose religious practices were described above, and to which Zarathustra could be referring in the Gathas when he condemns the Kavis and Catapons. It would make sense for the Median revolt against the Scythians to have a religious dimension to it, or at least for a nascent religion to use this conflict as an opportunity for evangelism. According to the Middle Persian chronicle Khudainameh, upon which Ferdowsi based his Shahnameh, Kavi Vishtaspa, King Goshtasp, had a son named Sepandyar, a Middle Persian form of the Gothic Avestan Spentayar, or friend of Spenta, a reference to Sepantaminu, a core concept developed by Zarathustra, to which we will turn momentarily. This Sepandyar is also mentioned in the Avesta. Esfandyar, as Ferdowsi calls him, became a crusader who converted many Turanians, i.e. Scythians, to Zoroastrianism, while Zarathustra was still alive and teaching at the court of Goshtasp. Subsequently, as noted above, the Scythians pushed back, and Zarathustra may have been killed when they overran the territory ruled by Goshtasp. Such a Scythian invasion did in fact take place around this time, when Cyrus overthrew his grandfather, and the chaos of transition between the Median kingdom and the First Persian Empire afforded the Scythians an opportunity to reassert their autonomy. The most hard-fought campaigns of Cyrus would be against these Scythians, specifically the Ma-Saka-Ta, or Great Scythian Horde, and he would be killed in 530 BCE in his attempt at a reconquest of their territory. After a dozen years of instability under the reign of Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, who also shows no traces of having been a Zoroastrian, a son of Vishtaspa, who is perhaps a younger brother or half-brother of Esfandyar, a military officer by the name of Darius, leads a coup d'etat to save the empire built by Cyrus. From the beginning of his reign in 522 BC, Darius's royal inscriptions are full of Zoroastrian concepts, which he uses to justify policies that are the bedrock of the Achaemenid Utopian project. The question remains why, if Zarathustra lived from 628 to 551 BCE, would the Gathas be composed in such an archaic language? Consider the following possible answer. Latin was used as a language for formal compositions, especially of theological and philosophical treatises, for more than 1,000 years after it had become a dead language. When René Descartes was composing his metaphysical meditations in 1641, it was already many centuries after Latin had been replaced by French, Descartes' own native language, Italian, Spanish, and other tongues that devolved from out of it. Even in the medieval epoch, the use of Latin by theologians and philosophers was for the sake of endowing their texts with the authority of what had once, long ago, been the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. None of these men, for example, in the generation of Thomas Aquinas, actually spoke Latin as a living language. The Avestan language is called that because, unlike in the case of Sanskrit, where we have extensive literature stretching over thousands of years in all genres, from scriptures to epics to romances and so forth, the only texts that we have in that language are the books of the Avesta. Within the context of Avestan itself, Gothic Avestan, namely the language that Zarathustra used to compose the Gathas, is a total linguistic isolate. It is closer to archaic Sanskrit than to young Avestan, and there is no other example of it anywhere besides the Gathas. Since there is no point of comparison, it has been a nightmare for scholars to interpret. Some Iranologists compare reading Gothic to taking a Rorschach test. It is therefore possible that this was not the language of Zarathustra, and that he may have composed the Gathas in that language to lend them the authority that they would need if they were to compete against the Sanskrit tradition of the Vedic Aryans. For all we know, the difference between Gothic and Sanskrit is simply that Gothic is poor Sanskrit. This is how the Italian of a poet like Dante devolved from out of Latin. In other words, young Avestan is the natural devolution of ancient Iranian from Sanskrit. On this view, the young Avestan texts could be from as soon as the next generation after Zarathustra, with the difference being that those who composed them, probably in Vishtaspa's realm in Bactria, far from the Achaemenid centers of power in Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, were not as competent in aping Sanskrit as Zarathustra had been. So-called Gothic Avestan would then be an attempt on the part of someone who speaks the devolved Avestan language to sound as polished and erudite as the Vedic Brahmins, when in fact he is not. As far as we can tell, his name may not even have been Zarathustra, Zarathustra, Avestan for golden camel. For his Latin writings, Descartes adopted the Latin name Cartesius. This practice was fairly common in Europe. Why not in ancient Iran? Maybe Zarathustra's real name was just Zarathustra. Zarathustra's conception of the properly ordered society is based on a certain idea of cosmic order. The ideal society is one that is brought into alignment with this cosmic order. The term that Zarathustra uses is Asha Vahishta. The Avestan word Asha, which is Arta in Old Persian, is a cognate of the Sanskrit Rata. It means order, and by extension, right. The English cognate of Rata, and in a sense truth, New Persian Rast, which also means right. The word Vahishta means the best. It was shortened to Veh, and then became Beh, which means good in Middle Persian, or Pahlavi, and the New Persian Behtar, or better, which is obviously the English cognate of the word. Finally, the New Persian word for paradise, Behesht, is based on this, rendering the literal meaning of better place. This is, of course, the exact translation of the Greek term utopos, utopia, into English. So Asha, or Arta Vahishta, which becomes Ordi Behesht in Middle Persian, means the best or highest or most fundamental order, in other words, cosmic order. In imagery that will be adopted by Heraclitus, Zarathustra symbolizes this Asha Vahishta as an ever-burning or inextinguishable fire. This fundamental basis of existence is beyond any and all dualities, as Zarathustra puts it in the Gathas. O Ahura, you offer that harmony to each of these two contenders by means of your hidden fire and truth. In the Gathas, Zarathustra also makes clear that the luminous and dynamic structure of this fire is an expression of the mind of Mazda, the wise one. Quote, "This I ask you, tell me truly, Ahura, who is the creator of Asha Vahishta? Who set the sun and stars in their paths? By whom does the moon wax and wane? Wise one, I yearn to know all this and more. This I ask you, tell me truly, Ahura, who holds the earth below? Who keeps the sky from breaking away? Who creates the waters and who the plants? Who lends the wind and clouds speed? Wise one, who is the creator of consciousness?" This I ask you, tell me truly, Ahura. Which artist fashioned the light and the darkness? What artist was it that planned sleep and awakening? Who made the dawn, day, and dusk that remind the wise of the ultimate goal? This I ask you, tell me truly, Ahura. Are the things I speak forth indeed true? Does serenity by its actions promote righteousness or right order? From whom has dominion been arranged through pure mind? For whom did you fashion this fruitful, joy-bringing world? This I ask you, tell me truly, Ahura. Who fashioned precious serenity with dominion? Who made the child lovingly turn toward the mother's breast? It is through these questions, Mazda, that I am able to recognize you as the creator of all by your progressive mentality, Sepanta Mainyu. As we can see in the last line here, the mind from out of which cosmic order unfolds is also progressive or evolutionary. The term Spenta Mainyu literally means progressive mentality. Spenta comes from the Avestan root spi, which means increase. It is a cognate of the Sanskrit spanda that signifies dynamic impulse or reverberating creative burst in Indian texts. That is very much the sense that we get in this line from the Gathas. Quote, Ahura Mazda's first, or primordial, thought blazed into myriad sparks of light and filled the entire heavens. Unquote. Mainyu, or mentality, is derived from the root mano, or mind, in both Avestan and Sanskrit. Spenta Mainyu becomes Sepand Mainyu in Middle Persian. Man is called that because unlike other beings in nature, he has a mind, mano. So Spenta Mainyu is the expansive mind, overflowing with inexhaustible energy, which affords us the possibility of, quote, progress from good to better good, unquote. Zarathustra recounts how he first discerned the progressive or bounteous, quote, ever-increasing, unquote, character of the mind of Mazdai Ahura during a state of rapture achieved through silent meditation. I realized you, Mazdai Ahura, to be progressive when I saw you at the birth of life. I realized you, Mazdai Ahura, to be progressive when I was encircled, or enraptured, by you through pure mind, and you showed me that silent meditation, Tishnu Maiti, silent thinking, contemplation, or silent reflection, is the best. I realized you, Mazdai Ahura, to be progressive when I was encircled by you through pure mind, and you asked of me, who are you? To whom do you belong? How would you, in these days of questioning, explain the directives to the living and to yourself? I realized you, Mazdai Ahura, to be progressive when I was encircled by you through pure mind. To your question, for what purpose do you seek knowledge? I answered, with the gift of homage to your fire, I shall meditate as long as I can in quest of righteousness. Asha Vahishta. This is a very revealing series of verses insofar as it offers us significant insight into what exactly Zarathustra means by Mazdai Ahura, which is often imprecisely translated as wise Lord or wise God. This is a question to which we will return momentarily. For now it should be noted that whatever this being is, it is capable of being perceived in its essence through introspective meditation, and the discerning person who enters into this state can communicate with this being and be asked thought-provoking questions by this being. It would be a reckless anachronism to suppose that Zarathustra is just using this construction as a rhetorical or literary device. Authors of compositions that are this archaic did not think in such stylistically sophisticated ways, and would not do so until centuries later, perhaps beginning with Plato. Zarathustra is describing an experience of rapture, wherein Mazdai Ahura actively engages him, asking him questions as if from within his own mind, as part of some kind of telepathic rapport. Before we can draw together Asha Vahishta and Sepanta Mainyu, in order to understand Mazdai Ahura, it is necessary to grasp the opposite of Sepanta Mainyu. In the Gathas, and in Zoroastrianism in general, Sepanta Mainyu is one of two primordial twins that strive with one another. Its opposite is Angra Mainyu. The Avestan word angra, from which the Persian gere or not and the English angry are derived, signifies being constrained or constricted. Therefore, Angra Mainyu is the constricted mentality or the constraining mind. Later in Middle Persian, Pahlavi, it was shortened to Ahriman and was misinterpreted as an evil deity that opposes Ahura Mazda or Ormazd, as he is called in Pahlavi scriptures. But in the original Gothic formulation of Zarathustra, Angra Mainyu is not on the level of Mazdai Ahura, although it is a principle of cosmic scope that acts to constrict or constrain the expansive power of Sepanta Mainyu, and also to exert a distorting, retarding, or degrading effect upon the expression of Asha Vahishta within our domain of experience. Just like those who misinterpret Angra Mainyu, Ahriman, as an evil deity, those who believe that it simply refers to a wrong-minded or regressive mentality in human individuals are also mistaken. As we shall see in its adoption by Pythagoras, who studied under the Magi, Angra Mainyu is a cosmic principle of chaotic disorder comparable to entropy in modern physics. Grasping this is absolutely key to understanding what Mazdai Ahura is, because otherwise one would be deluded into believing that Zarathustra is referring to some wise god that is as omnipotent and omniscient as the latter god figures of Christianity and Islam. In fact, Mazdai Ahura is not really God at all. It is a cosmic intelligence with a creative power that is finite, and with a mind that is superhumanly wise, but not omniscient. The omniscience and omnipotence of any putative deity would deny human beings the free will and self-determination that, as we shall see, is at the core of the message of Zarathustra and serves as the bedrock of his utopian project. Any omniscient God would know in advance everything that was necessarily going to happen. Any omnipotent God would be the effective power behind all things that take place in existence, reducing the will of the human individual to a mere illusion. Angra Mainyu plays an essential role in limiting the constructive power of the Wise One, and making this power dependent upon human initiative and cooperation, including in the struggle against the force of constriction and constraint. Angra Mainyu is also indispensable to understanding the specific conceptual differentiation between Asha Vahishta and Sepanta Mainyu. If it were not for Angra Mainyu, then Asha or Arta would be equivalent to its Sanskrit cognate of Rata. In other words, it would be a cosmic order that is already perfect and eternally completed. In the Vedic religion, this describes the state of Brahman, the supreme being, which is eternally omnipotent and also omniscient. This means that while the Atman, Sanskrit for the soul of the individual, could be enlightened into recognizing its identity with Brahman, this putative enlightenment is actually a dismissal of free will and personal agency as illusory phenomena that only ignorant and deluded people believe in. By contrast, as someone who affirms the free choice and actual agency of the individual, namely of a person who co-constitutes the cosmos on an existential level, Zarathustra has to deny that there is a supreme being and an eternally perfect cosmic order. Asha Vahishta is a cosmic order that is not perfect. It is perfectible and in the process of perfection. Sepanta Mainyu is the principle of the perfectibility of the cosmic order. On this view, unlike in the Sanskrit worldview, change is not mere illusion, and real development is taking place on every level of existence. For this to be the case requires a principle of chaos, corruption, and derangement that is not subsumed by divine order. This finally affords us an understanding of why exactly Zarathustra chose the name Ahura, or Ashura in Sanskrit, for the being that he describes as Mazdai, or wise. In the Vedic religion, the devas are gods, accept an eternally perfect divine order as the justification for their actions with respect to human beings and all other creatures. A justification of the caste system and of animal sacrifices, for example. As already noted above, a class of titans, or Ashuras, Ahuras, opposed these devas. In the idea of Mazdai Ahura, Zarathustra crystallizes the rationale for this rebellion that Hindus and even Buddhists consider to be a demonic revolt. Mazdai Ahura is a conception of the divine that inverts this demonization by rejecting the eternal perfection of an omnipotent and omniscient supreme being such as Brahman, postulating instead that there is nothing whatsoever that is not subject to change. Not arbitrary change, but progressively expansive development and improvement, perfectibility without any putative eternal perfection. Of course, the improvement is not a steady trajectory of positive development, but a dialectical struggle that results in a long-term net gain or a perpetual overcoming of entropy. That depends upon the persistence of a principle of chaos as the negative polarity in the dialectic that is indispensable to creative evolution. This idea will always be rejected by traditionalist-minded or perennialist people for whom a sense of all-encompassing security and belief in a timeless and incorruptible perfection are spiritual crutches without which they would lose the will to live. The struggle against Angra Mainyu involves the improvement of both the mind and the body. The mind of a person who aligns him or herself with Sepanta Mainyu is described by Zarathustra as Vohuman, or best mind. In Middle Persian, this becomes Bahman, and it is Beh Manesh in New Persian. The word human can be seen within Vohuman, and indeed human, pronounced Human, becomes a Persian name. The idea that only through the cultivation of the mind does one become a true human being is an idea that began in ancient Iran. We only see it adopted later by the Greco-Romans, probably through the spread of Mithraism into the Roman Empire. This idea, namely of humanitas, which becomes the basis for an education in the humanities as a process of humanization, was revived as a central idea of the European Renaissance. Interestingly, animal life came to be the symbol for Vohuman in Zoroastrianism. This is probably because how we treat animals is a reflection of our own humanity or lack thereof. As we shall see below, this was reflected in Achaemenid laws. The first step toward cultivating Vohuman is to discern the difference between Sepanta Mainyu and Angra Mainyu, and to deliberately choose to align oneself with the former rather than the latter. The injunctions to make this discerning choice are among the most noteworthy passages in the Gathas. Now I shall speak to those who wish to hear of the two principles, which are of importance even to the wise. I shall also, with veneration for good mind and the good consideration of righteousness, have praises for the Lord, so that you may see brilliant happiness. Hear the best with your ears and ponder with a bright mind. Then each man and woman, for his or herself, select either of the two. Awaken to this doctrine of ours before the great event of choice ushers in. Now the two foremost mentalities, known to be twins, are the better and the worse in thoughts, words, and deeds. Of these the beneficent choose correctly, but not so the maleficent. Now when the two mentalities first got together, they created life and not living. Until the end of existence, the worst mind shall be for the wrongful, and the best mind shall be for the righteous. Of these two mentalities, the wrongful mentality chose worst actions, and the most progressive mentality, as steadfast as rock, chose righteousness. Therefore, those who would please the wise God may do so by choosing true actions. Between these two, the devas did not decide correctly, because delusion came to them in their deliberations. Therefore they chose the worst mind, rushed in wrath and afflicted the human existence. But to the person who chooses correctly comes endurance of body and steadfast serenity through strength, good mind, and righteousness. Of all these, such a person shall be yours, because he has come fully out of the fiery test. Now I shall proclaim, hear and listen, you who have come from near and far as seekers. Now clearly bear these in mind. Let not the evil teacher, the wrongful, with his evil choice and perverted tongue, destroy life for a second time. Now I shall proclaim the two foremost mentalities of life. Of these the more progressive one told the retarding one thus: neither our thoughts nor teachings, nor intellects, nor choices, nor words, nor deeds, nor consciences, nor souls agree. Whoever, wise one, has set his mind on the better or the worse, sets his conscience accordingly with his actions and words. His desire follows his cherished choice. Wise one, this has been put as a choice that righteousness is for the promotion of the doctrine and wrong is for harming it. Therefore I long for union with good mind and disavow all associations with the wrongful. The truth-speaking person shall not consider any association with the wrongful, because those who have united their consciences in the reward are united in righteousness at the great event of choice. Let us pause to consider a number of noteworthy turns of phrase in these key passages, the meaning of which will not be clear to those unfamiliar with the teachings of Zarathustra, and which are often badly misinterpreted even by Zoroastrians. First, the term translated as brilliant happiness in the first paragraph is ushta, which is sometimes also rendered as radiant happiness in English. It is comparable to the Sanskrit ananda or the Greek eudaimonia. In other words, rather than referring to ephemeral happiness, which is contingent on the acquisition of certain material goods, or is dependent upon one or another fleeting pleasure, ushta is a profound joy and sense of blessedness that follows from aligning oneself with Asha by choosing Sepanto Mainyu and cultivating Bohuman. It is referred to as radiant or brilliant because it radiates or shines from out of a person in a psychical sense, like a metaphorical magnetic field that can be felt by others over whom it has a charismatic power. The second point that is worthy of note here are the repeated references to conscience and to the individual choice that each discerning man or woman has to make as to whether to align with Sepanto Mainyu or become a vehicle for Angra Mainyu. The very fact that the individual choice of a woman is mentioned at all, which aligns with Zarathustra's view that a woman can be a leader, and his acceptance of his daughter Puruchista's choice of her own husband, is absolutely astonishing considering the social conditions of the period in which the Gathas were composed. In fact, the conscience itself, known as Daina, was depicted as female in later Zoroastrian texts, in a manner akin to the feminine image of the anima in Greek culture. In Middle Persian, this word becomes deen, or religion, duty, but in the Avestan of Zarathustra it has the sense of an inner discernment, discrimination, and introspective, intuitive vision comparable to the Greek dianoia, with which it is a cognate, or the Sanskrit bodhi, the root of the word Buddha. This idea is so central to the message of the Gathas that Zarathustra's own name for his teaching is Daino Vahnui, or the good conscience. Note that the whole brunt of this idea is that there should be no coercion and that each individual ought to be allowed as much as possible to decide things for him or herself. This is related to the idea that in New Persian, from the time of Ferdowsi circa 1000 CE onwards, is referred to as azadegi, or free-spiritedness. At the same time, this does not mean condoning wickedness and malevolence. In fact, on a personal level, the righteous who choose to act conscientiously are enjoined to seek communion and combination of their efforts, hamazuri, but to totally and radically dissociate themselves from individuals who have failed to choose Sepanto Mainyu and who have become conduits for Angra Mainyu. This is because an apocalyptic event will occur in the future wherein the wicked will all be destroyed together. The great event of choice, quote-unquote, referred to in passages above, is a historical moment that will immediately precede this apocalypse. It is the prototype for the Judeo-Christian Last Judgment, a final opportunity for every individual in the world to make a choice between the two sides. In her translation, Nana Vuti renders it as final judgment. This brings us to the teleological dimension of Zarathustra's teaching, the fact that unlike the customary cyclical cosmologies of all of the other cultures of the time, Zarathustra presents us with the first future-oriented conception of history, which is clearly connected to the idea of progressive mentality at work in the cosmos. Integral to this teleology, which is also the first eschatology, or religious conception of future salvation, is the belief that there will be an end of history. Things will not cease to take place after this apocalypse, but it will involve a radical transformation of the conditions of life. In the Gathas, Zarathustra calls this transformation Frashokereti, which means the renewal or literally refreshening of the world. The English word fresh is a cognate of the Avestan fresh. This becomes frashgard in Pahlavi, or Middle Persian, Zoroastrian scriptures, such as the Zande Bohuman Yasn, or Bahman Yasht, where the event is described in some detail. The symbolic imagery here is of the entire world being subjected to a firestorm and being bathed in molten metal, from out of which the righteous will emerge unscathed, because they are, as it were, of the very element of fire themselves. This is what Zarathustra is referring to when he says that those who choose conscientiously, quote, come fully out of the fiery test, unquote. The wicked are, by contrast, consumed and incinerated by the flames. This alchemical metaphor is very significant in terms of the utopian project of Zarathustra, since it suggests very strongly that although we certainly ought to strive to transform our society into a utopia, no matter what time and place we are living in, all of these attempted utopias are merely heralds of a coming and final worldwide utopia populated only by the righteous. At this Feresh Tamam, anyone who remains will have actually become a fereshte, literally a refreshed person, a term that came to mean angel in the Persian language. In the Feresh Tamam state of the post-apocalyptic future after the Frashokereti, each of us who choose to live righteously will have become identical to our Farvahar or Fravashi, the ideal form of our most perfect or truest self, which acts as a kind of guardian angel urging us toward our eventual unification with it or actualization of the archetypal potential that it represents. There is a potential techno-scientific explanation of this idea. It is possible that a future science has encompassed what we consider the spiritual, and that has perfected technologies such as genetic engineering, robotics, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and time travel, which has made future humans or post-human fereshtes, angels, capable of reaching back in time and resurrecting certain dead people from any point throughout the historical continuum. If there are benevolent beings of this kind with this type of technology, it is possible that there are also comparable malevolent beings, and that this is what Zarathustra means when he refers to the devas. Specifically, this would make sense out of his reference to the devas having chosen wrongly during their deluded deliberations, and as a result their having rushed in wrath to afflict mankind with misery. That reference needs to be put next to Zarathustra's concern that this destruction of life could happen for, quote, a second time, unquote. Although the translation of the Gathas cited in this instance is that of Jafari, here he has departed from the original meaning of this passage, and a correction has been made accordingly, with a view to more accurate renderings of the original Avestan. Jafari is trying to suggest that Zarathustra did not actually believe in the devas when he mistranslates the line to make it seem as if it is directed against deva worshippers rather than actual devas. Quote, between these two, the seekers of false gods did not decide correctly, because delusion came to them in their deliberations. Therefore they chose the worst mind, rushed in wrath, and afflicted the human existence. Unquote. But Zarathustra, writing in a context that included at least oral traditions from the Sanskrit epic accounts of the battles between gods and titans that were later written down in the Mahabharata and Ramayana, may have thought that the devas are real beings. Zarathustra may have considered them to be false gods only in the sense that they are beings who have chosen falsehood, druj, and are agents of Angra Mainyu. It may not be the delusion of their followers that is being referred to here, but the deluded minds of the gods themselves. Pilunanavuti's more accurate translation of this line reads, quote, the devas did not discriminate wisely between these two. Confusion came upon them as they debated, and so they chose the worst mind. Straightway they fell headlong into wrath. The life of man sickened. Unquote. The great classical scholar M.L. West rendered it into English this way. Quote, between those two the very devas fail to discriminate rightly, because delusion comes over them as they deliberate. When they choose worst thought, they scurry together to the violence with which mortals blight the world." Unquote. Unlike West and like Nanabuti, Jafari does get the past tense formulation right. In this verse, Zarathustra is referring to an event that occurred in human prehistory. The deliberations, quote-unquote, mentioned in this passage could be a reference to the convocation of the gods before they launched a war with the Titans, Ashuras, Ahuras, that led to the destruction of a large part of mankind. Plato mentions this convocation called by Zeus for the purpose of destroying the titanic civilization of Atlantis. Contrary to what many secularizing modern scholars suppose, Plato insisted on the historical reality of this account, citing no less than Solon as the authority through whom he came to be aware of it. As already noted above, the destructive war of the devas is also the subject of Hindu epic literature, although in that context and in accordance with Vedic theology, the blame is placed on the Ashuras. When placed in the context of the idea of the Frashokereti and the great event of choice, what these lines from the Gathas suggest is that there is going to be another battle against the devas at the Last Judgment. It is not only wicked humans who ought to perish in the flames that refresh the world, but also the gods themselves. When we set apart the distinction between cyclical and teleological conceptions of history, this vision of the apocalypse is not all that different from that of Zarathustra's Indo-European cousins, the Norse, with their cosmology that ends with a Götterdämmerung, or twilight of the gods, wherein gods are destroyed together with mortals in an apocalyptic war. Now let us return to an exegesis of the Amesha Spentas as they appear in the Gathas. Since Vohuman is in alignment with Sepanta Mainyu, it has the character of ever-increasing or progressively deepening. 3 other states of being develop as a result of this, not successively but in tandem and as a consequence of this basic alignment. One of them is more mental and the other 2 are more physical, but all 3 involve the mind and the body, since in the teachings of Zarathustra, as compared to that of later Gnostics who misunderstood him, there is a profound psychosomatic interconnection. The first of these 3 states is Sepanta Armaiti, or ever-increasing, ever-deepening serenity. The Persian word Aramesh for serenity or tranquility is the newest form of this Avestan word Armaiti. In Middle Persian, Sepanta Armaiti became Sepanda Armat, and it is associated with the earth in Zoroastrianism. This is because being rooted or grounded brings serenity, and conversely, a serene person becomes unmovable in the sense of being imperturbable. It is very hard to knock such a person off balance. He or she is firmly grounded, like a master martial artist. Sepanta Armaiti has also been translated as ever-increasing devotion, in the sense that this equanimity of being rooted or grounded involves a feedback loop wherein the more one embodies it, the more firmly it takes hold of one. The second of these 3 states is Haurvatat, which became Khordat in Middle Persian. It means wholeness or health, and has the connotation of being of sound body and mind. It is symbolized by water, and this association is connected to how ancient peoples believed that baptism was a ritual that could heal and confer health upon those with physical or psychological ailments. The third of these states is Ameratat, or Amordad in Middle Persian. This has often been mistranslated as immortality, whereas the literal meaning of the word is undeadness, as in vitality. We can see this reflected in the fact that its symbol was lush greenery or vegetation. The idea is that alignment with Sepanta Mainyu through Vohuman will eventually yield not only a poised serenity and health, but also greater vitality. As one can see, the symbolic associations of these 3 states make them not only personal but also social. The relationship to earth, water, and vegetation signals the ecological dimension of Zarathustra's teaching. Sepanta Armaiti has actually been seen as a kind of Mother Nature goddess figure. 7 hymns that go back to the period of the Gathas and may have been composed by Zarathustra himself involve the veneration of rivers. We see this ecological dimension of Zarathustra's teaching reverberate in these verses of the latter Avestan text, Vi Deva Data, Pahlavi Vandidad, which praises the cultivation of land by sedentary farmers as compared to semi-nomadic raiders and plunderers. Quote, He who cultivates grain cultivates righteousness, and promotes and nurtures the religion with 100 new dwelling places." Unquote. This brings us full circle to Zarathustra's vision of utopia, as it can now be better understood in the context of the various Amesha Spentas, Middle Persian Amesha Spentas, or bounteous immortals. Zarathustra conceived of these aforementioned ideas as 6 rays, or emanations of Angra Mainyu. 5 of these 6 have been discussed thus far, with Kshatra Varya, or Vohu Kshatra, being the only one that remains outstanding. There is at least one long passage in the Gathas wherein Zarathustra evokes all 6 of these together, with Angra Mainyu itself being the 7th of them. "Come to me in essence and in vision, O Mazda. May I be renowned before the order of the Magi. By working through Ashal, Vahishta, and Vohuman, may the solemn promises made to you be understood and fulfilled by us. O Mazda, guide my work, so that I may continue to worship you through Vohuman. I will sing your praise and cling to Ashal Vahishta. Grant me, therefore, the everlasting blessing of your Haurvatot and your Ameratot. These twin powers are yours, O Mazda. They are constant companions of Ashal Vahishta, and dwell in the dazzling light of your wisdom. May your supreme mind bless us with these 2, who are in essence inseparable. Everything in the good life is yours, O Mazda, all which has been, which is, and which shall be. You give us our rewards in keeping with our actions. May the Ameratot in man grow through Vohuman and Ashal Vahishta under your Kshatra Varya. O Ahura, you are the most mighty Lord of wisdom, of Sepanta Almighty and Ashal Vahishta, which fosters human life. It is you who nourish the Vohuman and Vohu Kshatra. Arise within me, O Ahura, and fulfill my ardent desire for Haurvatot through Sepanta Almighty. These verses demonstrate the inextricability of the 6 Amesha Spentas that are akin to the rays of colored light that come out the other side of a prism, as compared to the white light of Angra Mainyu. In later Zoroastrianism, these philosophical or theosophical ideas were hypostatized together with Angra Mainyu itself as 7 archangels, symbolism that would be adopted wholesale by Judeo-Christianity together with so much else from Zoroastrianism. This is relevant to understanding Zarathustra's vision of utopia insofar as Kshatra Varya, sometimes also referred to as Vohu Kshatra, namely that dominion, Kshatra, or socio-political order that is, quote, most desirable, or, quote, choice-worthy, unquote, Vairya, or best, Vohu. In other words, the ideal society cannot be a secular one in the sense of lacking any overarching structure that orients the people of that society toward the divine. Justice on a social scale demands the alignment of a society with divine justice, Asha, through proper governance by those who are already wise. The freedom of choice that is at the core of Zarathustra's teaching and that was honored by the Achaemenid rulers would certainly not be consistent with a theocracy that would force citizens to adopt a certain religion or that would persecute people who are adherents of other faiths. However, it is clear from the relationship between the Amesha Spentas that the best and most desirable Kshatra, namely a utopia, can only come about if the people in a society are for the most part individuals who have aligned themselves with Angra Mainyu and who strive against Angra Mainyu by cultivating Vohuman so that they experience Sepanta Almighty and increasing Haurvatot and Ameratot. It is the duty of a just regime, namely one engaged in a utopian project, to ensure that this is the case. Consequently, in the Gathas, Zarathustra suggests that, quote, the lord and leader of the community, unquote, should be chosen by people based on his or her merit. He astonishingly, for his time, allows for the possibility that it could be a woman. This, however, should not in any way be misconstrued as an endorsement of democracy, as some have misinterpreted it to be. The very idea of democracy, whether in its modern secular form, such as that of France, or in the ancient theocratic form that it took in Athens, where Socrates was executed for heresy by the assembly, and that it still takes in the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a system anathema to what Zarathustra is proposing. This is why, when the Utopian project of Zarathustra was taken up by the Achaemenids, it took the form of an imperial state, New Persian, Dowlat-e-Shahanshahi. This is not because the idea of democracy never occurred to the Persians. Rather, there was actually a debate amongst Darius and the military officers who led the coup d'etat of 522 BC, together with him, over whether they should adopt a democratic form of government similar to that of Athens, or an aristocratic regime akin to that of other Greek city-states, or whether an imperial state was most suitable to fostering socio-political justice. They chose the latter, and the inscriptions of Darius carved on rock cliffs and palace walls make it crystal clear that this had everything to do with the teachings of Zarathustra and was deliberately aiming at forging a Vohu Khashatra. The symbol for Vohu Khashatra, or Khashatravarya, Middle Persian Shahrivar, is metal. Think of metal coins minted by a government, or of the metal of a just ruler's sword being forged in the fire of the cosmic justice that is Asha, or Arta Vahishta, Ordi Behesht, forging the earthly realm into the mold of that cosmic order.